So the Department of Social Anthropology at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland becomes a key site for this type of work. Indeed, the first book had been published in 1947 by Kenneth Little called Negroes in Britain, a study of Cardiff's Tiger Bay that you see represented here in a picture post image from this period. And his student, Michael Banton, publishes The Colour Quarter in 1955, and then Sheila Patterson, The Dark Strangers in 1963. These works are works by anthropologists trying to find out how it is that different communities defined by race could be assimilated into Anglo-white British culture. They recognized the key differences, they acknowledged the legitimacy of those differences, but they wanted to promote assimilation. The other area was the development of the study of so-called community relations. And a whole series of voluntary organizations had been working to try and provide colonial migrants access to social services and to advocate for them in terms of jobs and housing, etc. But in 1962, the Immigration Act also sets up for the first time a new community relations, an Institute for Community Relations, which is trying to coordinate the activities of these local voluntary bodies. And again, the emphasis there is on trying to find mechanisms for integration. This became accelerated with when the Labour Party is returned to office in 1964. And the Labour Party develops this approach to race relations that basically tries to integrate the idea of immigration and integration. So Roy Hattersley, who was one of the Labour Party figures dealing with this issue, said, without integration, limitation is impossible, and without limitation, integration is impossible. So one of the first things that they do in 1965 is to pass a race relations bill, precisely the type of act that Card had been calling for since the early 1960s, that outlawed discrimination on racial grounds in public places, but didn't make it a criminal offence. It also established a new race relations board in 1966 to try and deal with cases to try and promote better race relations. It wasn't until the Immigration Act of 1968 that racial discrimination in housing, employment, and public service became was made illegal, and it was this act that basically catalysed the famous speech by Enoch Powell that I'll talk to you about next week, warning that unless immigration was going to be stopped, in this case of East Asian of Asians from Kenya, that the rivers of blood would flow through Britain. And I'll return to that next week. But I have 10 minutes left to talk about European integration. Margaret Thatcher would be hugely proud of me. Okay. So the first thing to do is to correct, I think, the common sense view that you get from reading or listening to the American media about relations between Britain and the European project. Britain has, since the days of Mrs. Thatcher, routinely projected itself as anti-European, as being opposed to European integration, and as trying to defend British sovereignty against the process of political and economic unity. It's for that reason that Britain is one of the few places in Europe that is not that has kept its own currency. But in fact, even Mrs. Thatcher's hero, Winston Churchill, thought that there was huge potential in a project of European integration, because Churchill believed that the British Empire needed to be bolstered by that he believed that in the developing bipolar world of the Cold War, that the British Empire wasn't going to be enough as a counterpoint to the struggle between the Soviet Union and the United States, and that Europe had to step up to play an intermediary role, that Britain and the British Empire wasn't enough to do that. Nonetheless, European integration is in important ways facilitated by America as part of its Cold War objectives, to try and maintain the stability of Europe so that the Berlin Wall, as it was developing, would be the endpoint of the forward march of the Soviet Union. So the Marshall Plan was, of course, absolutely central here to the economic reconstruction of Europe in 1948, but so was the formation of the European Coal and Steel Community in 1951, the first pan-European attempt at coordination. And then finally, in 1957, we have the signing of the Treaty of Rome that creates the European Economic Community itself, signed by Belgium, France, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and West Germany. Now, Britain is not part of that list, you will note. And that was because, in large way, despite Churchill's interest in European integration, the British Foreign and Colonial Office saw Britain's world as being still locked in its old imperial spheres of influence. That changed in the late 1950s and early 1960s as the British Empire began to crumble. Britain needed some other platform to exercise an extra-national influence. And it was encouraged to do that by the United States, which wanted Britain to be at the heart of the European project so that it could have its closest European ally involved. And it was encouraged by the grisly reality of British economic fortunes, which the Empire had failed to rescue. British export industries basically had not been saved by the Sterling area and by the Colonial Development and Welfare Acts. Indeed, between 1952 and 1965, Britain's GDP per capita was the lowest in Europe. So Britons looked to the continent of Europe and saw the type of economic vitality that many wished to happen in Britain itself. And during that same period of time, trade with Europe rose from 12 to 18%, at the same point as trade with the Commonwealth fell from 45 to 35%. So there was a basic economic reality here, as well as a geopolitical shift going on. And this was a move that effectively was agreed to by both political parties. Now, the first application for European to admission under the Treaty of Rome was by the Conservative government in 1963, Howard Macmillan's administration in 1963. Then came the application by Howard Wilson and the Labour Party in 1967, both rejected by the European Community, and finally success in 1972 under the leadership of Edward Heath and the Conservative Party. Okay, any questions before I wrap this beast of a lecture up? No? Okay. So a few basic points that I want to reiterate. The first is that, arguably, there's no more transformative period of time in terms of Britain's relationship with the wider world than in the decades of the 1950s and the 1960s, or rather from 1947 through to 1972. I can't think of any other period of time during the course of this, during the chronology of this class, where that transformation was quite so huge. And a key part of this was about Britain being caught between three different geopolitical forces: its own empire, the developing American empire in the Cold War, and the project of European integration. And in a way, we can't understand any of these processes without thinking of the interrelationship of those three components. Nonetheless, even though some of this is about geopolitical strategy and relations, it's also important to emphasize that they had a huge effect on the development of the system of social democracy in the post-war period. And we shouldn't think that it was simply decolonization that played a big role here, and that the inseparability of, say, the Colonial Development and Welfare Acts and the Sterling area and colonial migration. Clearly, the empire and social democracy are deeply embedded with each other in many ways, but so too were the key financial and political relations with America and the European project. Nonetheless, what we're beginning to see in this lecture is the agonized emergence of Britain as a multiracial and multi-faith nation. It's at this time that people in Britain begin to live around people of colour for really the first time in any type of significant scale. And this catalyzes a defence of Anglo-whiteness, but it also creates the beginning of the forms that we would come to understand as multiculturalism in the 1970s and the 1980s, which I'll talk to you about in a couple of weeks. The other last point that I want to make here is that it's not just that the migration of colonial subjects in Britain doesn't just lead to a sharper definition and defence of a so-called white way of life. It also puts into sharp relief the very idea of the class system in Britain itself. There's a profound way in which colonial migration leads to a new articulation of what the white working class looked like and the type of way of life it was expected to have. And it's that issue that I will talk to you about on Thursday. Thank you.